Next, we have Hugh Smithies. This year, Hugh achieved significant recognition within the discipline of geochemistry by receiving the Gibb Maitland Medal at the annual Geological Society of Australia Awards for his outstanding and substantial contributions to geoscience in Western Australia. Hugh is recognised as a world leader in geochemistry, and his work has contributed to a better understanding of the Earth's early evolution, the processes of construction of the continental crust and associated greenstones, the switch in the Meso-Archean to more modern style plate tectonic processes, and the origin of ultra-high temperature magmatism associated with the largest supervolcano to ever have existed on this planet. His seminal work on the relationship between sanukitoids and gold mineralisation has recently been cited by numerous exploration companies as a major contributing factor in the discovery of several new gold deposits. Hugh's talk today is titled A Lithium-Pegmatite Paradigm Consistent with Western Australia's Archean Geology. Please join me in congratulating and welcoming Hugh.
Thanks, Michelle. No pressure. I just want to quickly report on a few insights that are coming out of work that we've recently started doing in the lithium pegmatite field. So, petrogenetic models for lithium pegmatites basically divide between anatectic models and extreme fractionation of granite models. The anatectic models basically remain speculative. They might work in a few specific cases. Certainly in terms of the Western Australian Archean, I don't think they're particularly applicable at all, because in most cases we can demonstrate relationships with granites. On the other side of the coin, the granite fractionation models are heavily biased by Phanerozoic research outcomes, which posit that lithium pegmatites form when you get a thick sedimentary sequence, you melt it to produce an S-type granite, and then you fractionate that granite to eventually produce lithium pegmatites. Now, this is the problem. In the Archean of Western Australia, which actually produces has produced the vast amount of hard rock lithium throughout the world, we actually never had sedimentary sequences that melted, that actually produced a melt source. And we know that because we don't have the S-type granites that represent evidence that sedimentary sources melted. Okay, so on the left-hand side, this diagram shows. So S-type granites themselves are extremely periluminous rocks. So they have a high aluminium saturation index, typically above 1. And the thing about S-type granite petrogenesis or their evolutionary sequences is that with increasing silica, they don't dip below that 1.1 level. The only granites in either of the Western Australian cratons that are spatially and temporally related at all with the lithium pegmatites are low calcium granites, and good cases have been made that link those genetically with pegmatites. So if we have a look at them on the right-hand side of this diagram, we've got the low calcium granites for both the Pilbara and the Yilgarn, and we can see that whilst some of them do have aluminium saturation indices above 1.1. They all track back to parental magmas that have considerably lower aluminium saturation indices. So these are not S-type granites. In fact, these have greater affinities to A-type granites. So either these leucogranites aren't related to the pegmatites, and then we've got to start thinking about entertaining the anatectic models again, or they are related to the pegmatites, and we have to question the requirement for a sedimentary melt source region. Okay, so a crustal melt source is extremely unlikely to contain abundant minerals that actually contain lithium as a stoichiometric component. You don't get melt sources that are rich in spodumene, for example. So lithium in a melt source is almost exclusively going to be hosted within micas, and so that means that the only critical aspect for a melt source is that it must have previously crystallised large amounts of mica, and these either retain or capture lithium, depending on whether lithium was already in the system or whether the lithium came in during melting. And that's in fact why the sedimentary source models do work in those cases where we have sedimentary sequences to melt. And where we don't have those sedimentary sequences to melt, we have to look for other mica-bearing source regions. Okay, so we turn to the Archean. Now this is a map of the Yilgarn Craton. We've got all the current major lithium projects in the big gold diamonds. What we know about lithium pegmatites on both cratons is that they are structurally hosted within greenstones, but extremely close to the greenstone granite boundary. The other thing shown on this map, the little red dots, are the occurrences so far that we have of the low calcium leucogranites. And those dots are scaled to according to the concentration of lithium. These granites aren't particularly associated with the greenstones. In fact, they form the main component of the granitic seas in between the greenstone belts. And looking at the concentrations within these granites, a remarkable observation is that they rapidly increase in lithium concentration in proximity to the greenstone contacts. And this is actually quite an amazing revelation, because this is actually reflecting a source feature. This is telling us that the source region for those leucogranites that are rich in lithium, the source region has been preconditioned. And it's also telling us that that source region also lies in proximity to the granite greenstone contact. And we know it's a source feature because the compositions of the lithium-rich leucogranites, other than simply their enrichments in lithium, their compositions are quite different. So this is a neodymium versus silica plot, and it shows us that those low calcium granites that have high lithium contents are significantly more radiogenic than most otherwise similar low lithium leucogranites. The other thing we get from this diagram is the revelation that the lithium-enriched granites are isotopically similar. They're as juvenile as synucleotoids. And synucleotoids actually represent the most juvenile felsic component of Archean crust. And synucleotoids are formed through partial melting of metasomatically altered lithospheric mantle, and they're actually an integral component in the late stage evolution of nearly all neo-Archean greenstone belts. So here's another map of the Yilgarn Craton. I emphasise the Yilgarn because that's where we have the most data. Now this is a contoured neodymium isotope map, and this is essentially showing us the neodymium isotopic compositions of the granitic melt sources throughout the Yilgarn. This has got nothing to do with the greenstone, it's got nothing to do with mafic rocks. However, if we look at the more radiogenic components of this map, so those anomalies, the radiogenic anomalies are in the deeper greens and the yellows. These anomalous zones actually encompass and surround the greenstone belts. And those anomalies can be explained in terms of incorporating synucleotoids into the granite source regions surrounding the greenstone belts. And in the eastern goldfields, we know that this occurred at between about 2690 and 2655. So that's the magmatic period immediately prior to the magmatism that produced the low calcium granites and the pegmatites itself. So melting of these regions around the greenstone belts is in fact very, very likely to be what's imparting these quite intriguing isotopic compositions, specifically on those low calcium granites that have high lithium concentrations. The other interesting thing about synucleotoids is that they represent the most hydrated magmas that we see in the Archean. In fact, they have water contents of upwards of 9%, and as soon as they're placed into the lower crust, they start fractionating, they start crystallising and fractionating. So those hydrous contents only increase to the point where they rapidly exsolve fluid phases, which obviously escape into the country rock. Now, where we see alteration around synucleotoids, those alteration zones are extremely biotite rich, and they contain up to 300 ppm lithium. And the mica itself contains up to 700 ppm lithium. So immediately here we have the biotite rich source region that we're looking for the source of these low calcium granites that spawn lithium pegmatites. Not only that, we know that those source regions are lithium rich. Another interesting thing to come out of this is actually research that Fawn has been doing in her spare time when she hasn't been looking after us. And she's been looking at the thermal thermal evolution of the Yilgarn Craton. So she's been examining the high concentrations of extraordinarily high concentrations of radiogenic heat-producing elements in the Yilgarn crust, and how these elements have been redistributed, essentially zone refined to the upper crustal levels with time. And what she's found is that exactly at that period when we should be looking at starting to melt the crust to produce the low calcium granites, the Yilgarn crust is in fact absolutely primed for biotite dehydration melting at extraordinarily shallow levels in the crust. In fact, those levels are appropriate for melting in the root zones of greenstone belts. Okay, so this is the wrap-up slide. The absence of a viable sedimentary source for the granites, the fractionate form lithium pegmatites, it's actually clearly not a problem because we have the pegmatites themselves. They've got to get there somehow. The problem is identifying an alternative source. Our preliminary results, I think, that we've come up with an extremely plausible alternative that perhaps represents a new paradigm for grassroots exploration for lithium pegmatites. And I want to emphasise that this certainly isn't a Sanuka story. It's possibly not even a lithium pegmatite story. It's simply a crustal evolution story, and the types of processes we're talking about, I guess, in a way suggest that lithium pegmatite formation is a predictable consequence of simply initiating and evolving greenstone belts along translithospheric structures. Now, I was asked to throw in a few pointers as to what I would be looking for if I was looking for lithium pegmatites, but purely coming from the granite geochemical perspective. So that's the list there. You can read that in your spare time because I'm probably out of time.